Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Josipa, the President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. And welcome to day 2 of our second annual Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference. Before we get started, however, I would like to once again thank and acknowledge the original guardians of the unceded territories upon which CUTRIC is established today. Those ancestral lands and waters belong to Indigenous people of Vancouver, Lethbridge, Toronto, Waterloo, Kingston, Hamilton, and Montreal. CUTRIC remains committed to recognizing and honoring the dedication and sacrifice of Indigenous nations across Canada. Thank you and merci.
Thank you, Josipa. Rebonjour à tous. Mon nom est Carla Guillaume, coordonnatrice et agente de liaison du CUTRIC pour le Québec. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais moi aussi remercier les gardiens des territoires non cédés sur lesquels le CUTRIC se trouve aujourd'hui. Ces terres et ces eaux ancestrales appartiennent aux peuples autochtones de Vancouver, Lethbridge, Toronto, Waterloo, Kingston, Hamilton et Montréal. Le CUTRIC demeure déterminé à reconnaître et à honorer le dévouement et le sacrifice des nations autochtones à travers le Canada. Notre équipe vous dit merci.
Merci, Carla. Yesterday, we heard how the COVID-19 crisis is merging with the gender crisis, the racial crisis, the climate crisis, and it's impoverishing people, leading to frustration and causing anger worldwide. But we also learned how we in the low carbon smart mobility sector can help to address these crises by proactively investing in socially aware green infrastructure. We can create an economic landscape that transforms humanity and profoundly redoes it, reshapes it, restructures it, as profoundly as the Renaissance restructured the 15th century, and as profoundly as industrialization created the 19th. We in the low carbon smart mobility industry can use these crises as an opportunity to recast the future as a zero carbon interconnected intermodal one that sets us free through mobility and connects us all. But as we work towards that goal, let's be aware of our immediate reality, economically at least. It's a pandemic economy. The pandemic economy is a concept that's starting to define a new decade. A decade that was supposed to be the harbinger of a zero carbon economy ahead. We've already heard that global jurisdictions that have seemingly conquered the coronavirus are starting to see flare-ups once again. Beijing, New Zealand, to just start the few. The new normal is living with a virus that is deadly to the vulnerable, deadly to the poor, deadly to the aged, and deadly to frontline workers. And as we're all wondering, what shape will define our economy going forward? A V shape, a W shape, a logarithmic curve that plateaus and underperforms for years ahead. We all know that we're going to have to figure out a way to live with this virus and live with viruses like it for a long time to come, at least as long as we plan to live in a globalized economy. So pandemic economy is now defined as not only COVID-19 influenced, but also by the plethora of calamitous epidemiological events, zoonotic viruses, tropical illnesses, and more known illnesses like cholera and malaria that will spread ubiquitously throughout this century because of a warming planet and globalization combined. Those illnesses damage our ability to get to work, they damage our ability to create a family, they damage our ability to live a life that we want to lead, they damage our ability to drive a bus and to run a city. And they will overlap equally with destructive, calamitous events caused by the climate emergencies that we've seen ravaging our nation and nations around the world. We've already seen in Canada alone, from British Columbia to Fort McMurray, to Australia, to the Amazon, wildfires out of control. They've toxified the air we breathe. They obscured the vision of the cities that we had in our minds for the future. They are causing and leading to the destruction of our communities in ways that we could never have envisioned 10 or 20 years ago. Or if we could have envisioned them, we were ignoring. Those have been followed by once in a 100-year floods that have washed away our communities from Calgary to Montreal to Fredericton. Massive floods that have put into question our ability to actually even address human-made climate change. So to put it bluntly, we've destroyed Mother Nature and she's destroying us back. And unless we start to work with her on her collaborative terms, she will not relent. She will not let us continue to consume the way we've been consuming since the end of World War II, with materialistic flair supported by the core ingredients of globalization: cheap oil, cheap travel, and instantaneous communications. Worldwide, as we ship and move people, goods, and services across transnational boundaries and borders in the relentless pursuit of materialistic wealth and immediate, if not addictive, consumer gratification, the concepts of reduce, reuse, recycle have never taken on so much meaning as today. Going green is part of the climate solution. There is no doubt. It will help us work with Mother Nature by reducing our consumption, reducing our use of road space, reducing even our industrialization of land, possibly by reducing globalization in and of itself and a priori. And it will do this by changing and improving our attitudes about what a good life is composed of and what type of material goods and wealth a rich life actually has to be composed of. But let's not romanticize the situation, because Mother Nature is certainly not romanticizing it for us. Going green will not be painless. It will affect the incomes of many households and national economies. Hundreds of millions of people, including many of them here in Canada, who are dependent on the status quo to live well, where the status quo is dependent on oil wealth. The mid-2010s brought us more material wealth than was imaginable by previous generations, because money was cheap and debt was cheap. By 2019, terms like quantitative easing had stopped being uttered on every nightly newscast, and the evils and the perils of the housing crisis and the Great Recession had passed into our distant memories. As pundits on Bloomberg already started to talk about a slowing economy into 2020, and even before we knew about COVID-19, there was an entire generation of teenagers and young people that had already gone to university and college with no living personal memory of the Great Recession or the housing crisis, or at least no cognizant sense of what it did or possibly did to their parents or their household economies. Some of these young people are now trying to find jobs, and there aren't any. Or they found some jobs, but they're temporary. Or they're jobs that are likely to be chopped when Q3 comes around and our bottom lines and balance sheets come up to bite us. Fast forward to March, April, May of this year. The world stopped in fits, in phases, and not all at the same time, that is sure. But the world did stop for a brief moment in time. And we all assessed the possibilities of going green. Clear skies over Beijing, quiet highways in Toronto, uncongested roads in Montreal. But just like a lot of the fake photos of wildlife in cities that started to crop up on all manner of social media, the fakeness of our sense of we're a global ship and we're all aboard together emerged as well. COVID-19 did not affect us all equally. We know that. And its economic impact will not affect us all equally. We also know that. It has been exacerbated and has exacerbated social, digital, and political divisions. The poor got poorer, the rich huddled and self-isolated, and the middle class became exhausted, stressed, and broken. COVID-19 has caused what we might consider to be a 3-month economic flu, terrible at its worst, showing signs of getting better, but needing a long recovery process ahead. And just like the flu, some of us won't survive. The 21st century green revolution that we all want to see and support and promulgate is not entirely dissimilar, but with a much more positive outcome, I believe. The radical transformation to a green and much needed, brighter, safer, smarter, low carbon, zero carbon economy isn't a flu, but it is something like a vaccine that might make us sick to start with before making us better over the long term. Or maybe a better analogy is it's like an addiction. That we have to wean ourselves off of. Deep commitments and urges, desires and needs that for some is a matter of life and death. And why would I say that? I would say it because going green will be great for many of us, but extremely painful for some as well. It will be healthier in the long term, but our industry, transit and transportation, needs to figure out how to help make it less painful for those people for whom it will be destructive, and we cannot deny it. Those Canadians and those people worldwide whose livelihoods do today and in the foreseeable future depend on oil, oil products, oil services, and the petroleum economy and everything that it gives birth to. We all know the good figures, and we love them. The hundreds of thousands of new jobs in Canada and globally that nonprofit organizations have already started to tabulate in advocacy for green economic stimulus. The hundreds of thousands of jobs in transit and mobility and rail and zero emissions vehicle manufacturing and energy storage and hydrogen production and solar panels and all of the data systems that go along with that. All of the great new green jobs, the growing green jobs, which are set to keep us growing over the next several decades. This is good news, and it's good for the body politic. The painful part of this narrative is that for those families who are dependent upon the oil industry, they will lose established wealth through this transition to a greener future. Whether they lose it only over the short term or the long term is dependent on their personal circumstances and the economies they live in. But there is no doubt that there will be loss of household economic revenue in many cases, including in Canada. I grew up in Alberta. I went to school in Alberta. I returned to Alberta many, many times to try to launch my career. And when we started CUTRIC in 2015 and 2016, we went to Alberta, and I had 2 staff in Alberta. And we went from north to south, Fort McMurray to Lethbridge, looking for companies and organizations that would get involved in low carbon smart mobility with us. The transit agencies were open-minded, the universities were ready and keen, but we could not find small to mid-sized businesses or larger enterprises willing to invest and get involved. Unless it was oil, there was no investment portfolio, desire, or goal to get involved in the green or low carbon smart mobility sector. So it was difficult. Today, it's slightly different. There is a burgeoning hydrogen economy in Alberta. But Alberta, as one example of many jurisdictions around this world, is still primarily defined by one resource alone, and that's oil. And the pivot to green mobility and green transportation and smart cities and a zero carbon economy ahead will not be easy for Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Lethbridge, Fort McMurray, to name a few. Some of the families there will lose out, especially those families whose income and revenue is dependent on direct oil revenues. They work in the patch, their children work in the patch, they sell into or out of the patch, or they're employed in the plethora of services that feed people and hotel them and serve them for overnight stays, or service the industries that support them. They clothe them, they entertain them, they house those workers in the oil patch. Many of those families are no longer only in Alberta either. From Newfoundland to British Columbia, anywhere that sends men and women to Northern Alberta to make a living is going to be impacted by our shift away from the oil industry into a green economy. 2 months ago, when the price of a barrel of oil dropped into negative terrain and bonuses started to dry up and executives across North America started to worry about their own jobs, we should have mostly been worrying about the high school diploma holders who won't be finding another job making that much money that easily in the green economy or potentially anywhere else again. Let's be honest, we all laud our industry because green innovation, green transportation, smart mobility, it creates high-paying jobs, highly qualified jobs for smart people with lots of university and lots of college and lots of technical learning, people with PhDs and MBAs and law degrees and engineering degrees. We're going to be okay. There are lots of jobs for us in the future. But what about the high school graduate rig operator who earned $150,000 with overtime and had a good life off an entirely other industry? Where is he or she going to go? That's just a little bit of Canada, where social health care, socialized education, other public infrastructure tries to catch families as they start to fall. But let's look at the global world that we live in. Let's take an example from the last decade that still lives with us today because of the refugee crisis that it has created. On December 17th in 2010, a 26-year-old Tunisian grocery vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire after police confiscated his belongings. Mr. Bouazizi had lived in an area of Tunisia where youth unemployment was over 40%. The days following his death, if you recall, had everyone from students to the wealthy classes showing up on streets and protesting for a plethora of reasons. And in the first months of 2011, the protest movement spread across North Africa and the Middle Eastern nations. The protests and sometimes the riots across North Africa and the Middle East occurred at a time, as we may also recall, immediately following the housing crisis and the Great Recession. There was already social discontent in many of the countries that became part of the Arab Spring. Bread riots had already emerged throughout the 2000s in many of those jurisdictions because of the increase in food supply costs. But the global economic crisis from 2007 to 2009 exacerbated those divisions, not unlike COVID-19 is exacerbating our divisions today. Most of those countries in North Africa and the Middle East were heavily dependent, and still are, on oil exports for ongoing income and revenue. And they were already struggling with high unemployment and socio-political disparities. When the housing crisis in North America spread and became a global recession, the global demand for manufactured goods dried up. We can all recall that if you're of a certain age. If you're about 35 years old and older, you can recall that jobs dried up and you started to buy less. People bought fewer cars, they bought fewer homes, they took out less debt. And that spread because when people buy less stuff, there's less need for oil. Less need for oil meant less revenue for the countries of North Africa and the Middle East. And with less revenue coming in from countries like Algeria that saw a 20% drop in their exports of oil, and Libya, nearly 30% drop in their exports of oil. When those oil revenues started to drop, these countries and their governments, which had been relatively protected by our ongoing constant demand for oil in the developed world, started to experience extreme price volatility. And the Great Recession, that had also created job losses across Europe and America, led to the great diasporic communities of North Africa and the Middle East drying up their remittances home. So here you had a number of countries in North Africa and in the Middle East who saw their oil revenues dry up in a matter of a few years and saw diasporic remittances dry up over the course of the same period. Global economic recession, a withering of demand for oil globally, overlaid with social inequality and political exclusion from positions of decision-making power. And an exhausted, frustrated boy set himself on fire. Some people have called the Arab Spring the world's first social media revolution because Facebook and Twitter helped democracy protesters organize and rally. Around the English-speaking world, we saw it as a series of anti-government protests, rallies, rebellions, and clashes with government forces across much of the Arab world and, of course, North Africa. What were people fighting for? A better quality of life, bread, water, with women at the forefront of many of the early rebellions and riots and protests. Those protests spread from Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and onwards. Dictatorial rulers were deposed in some cases, slim democracies, and then coups ensued. Social violence grew, armed government opposition reacted. From Morocco to Saudi Arabia, a major slogan of the demonstrators was, "The people want to bring down the regime." And why? The people that formed the Arab Spring were angry with exclusion from privilege and opportunity. Exclusion made worse by a shrinking set of social services and jobs that their oil economy could not afford. Let us take note. People protested for stable food supplies, stable and transparent policing, transparent justice systems, accessible high-quality education. And all these things cannot be afforded when a government heavily dependent or a society heavily dependent upon stable oil revenue starts to see its revenues disappear. Less money, fewer services. Unlike we who join this conference from our privileged positions in many cases, not all, but in many cases, from our privileged positions of democratic jurisdictions around the world, which give us the right to protest, people in undemocratic states have absolutely no option, and very rarely no option other than to protest or rebel in the streets as a means of change, and to face all the weight of militarized repression and backlash that comes with those actions. The loss of oil revenues in petrostates that are undemocratic to start with has already led to death and destruction. These scenarios are exacerbated by climate events causing desolation, arid land, extended drought periods without sufficient irrigation or mitigation. People are starving, they're running out of water, they're running out of options, and they have no options for regular change in government. Let us be aware of these geopolitical realities so that we know when we are working to solve green mobility in Calgary or Toronto, it's not enough. We need to figure out a way in this community to solve mobility, transition to green transportation, support the growth of a green economy globally in a way that Canadians and Europeans and Middle Easterners and North Africans and South Americans and Asians benefit from. And so our work continues. Federally at CUTRIC, we believe the government is aware of many of these issues, and they're aware that it is going to be a painful transition for many families in Canada. Just over a month ago, the federal government announced nearly $2 billion to clean up orphan oil wells in Alberta. When I was young, this was an issue. Back when I was in grade 6, giving my first speech about why sour gas should not be developed and produced just outside my community in Marlborough Park in Calgary, we were already learning about orphaned oil wells. So this is a good sign that the federal government is recognizing, look, we need to create some economic stimulus in a green economy in a jurisdiction that is oil dependent. And this is a common ground mechanism for doing so. But it's clearly going to take a lot more. And green transit and mobility has a big role to play here. A big role to play in helping our society exit out of petro dependence and merge and transition into green reality. We need to figure out a way in the transition to the green economy to employ Canadians who don't have a university degree, who don't have a college degree, who cannot jump easily from being an accounts or sales manager at an oil company to being an accounts or sales manager at a solar panel manufacturing firm. Transit and mobility, first of all, can help us move people, move families, more quickly, more conveniently, and cheaply, so that if they do lose their incomes, at least they can move into new opportunities. They have the mobile ability to go and find those new opportunities in a way that is economically convenient for their households. But transit can actually do even better. Transit's a big employer. More than 50,000 jobs across Canada today, according to the Canadian Urban Transit Association. But why is it not 500,000 jobs? Why is it not 1 million people in Canada are employed in transit today? Lots of people start off as a bus driver and become managers, directors, and the such. Our former minister, Minister Amarjeet Sohi of Natural Resources Canada, was a bus driver in Edmonton and became Canada's Minister of Natural Resources, who, by the way, helped us with our Pan-Canadian electric bus demonstration project. So we could innovate, transit could innovate, not just to be better, but to be bigger, much, much bigger. More trains, more buses, more streetcars, more dedicated lanes, more employees. Cities designed around transit can employ more people in transit. Cities from Fort McMurray to Lethbridge to St. John's could benefit from employment opportunities, a bigger, better, more innovative transit system that creates more jobs. Speaking from a place of privilege, of economic and political privilege, we're all privileged in Canada, Europe, and the United States to have functioning democracies that we can use to toss leaders out when we don't like what they're doing. And regardless of what we might think of political leaders of the day in our jurisdictions, we must recognize that in Canada and Europe and the United States, we have constitutions that do give power to the people to toss politicians out and end their careers. Globally, we are geopolitically privileged in that regard. And our government knows it. Canadians are expressing more and more concern about the way in which the climate's going, about the fact kids are worried about surviving, about the fact that gendered and racialized executive jobs of a past built on oil wealth are not the free and fair jobs of the future that we want for ourselves and our families in a low carbon economy. And our government sees it too. It knows voters, and especially women and youth voters, want climate change action. They want jobs in this sector. They want investment to build a green economy. At CUTRIC, we believe the government's listening. Just look at what they've done. They've appointed Catherine McKenna as the head of infrastructure. She is somebody who's established her no-nonsense, intelligent approach to environmentalism and eco-stimulus in her roles over several years as environment minister. They also appointed Krista Friedland, the country's most powerful minister and voice of the nation in NAFTA negotiations, as deputy prime minister to forge common ground from the resource extraction oil fields of the West to the auto parts shop floor of the center to the fisheries of the East. And there are Canadians worldwide helping us too. Mark Carney, head of Bank of Canada, then head of the Bank of England, and now UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. As governments around the world, including Canada and globally, are asked to open their doors to climate action protest and other forms of protest, and to support those protests, even when they shut down our economies briefly. Let's keep hope that the value of democracy is our ability to instigate change fundamentally, even one as big and as open as socially aware, free, fair, and green economic stimulus, one that our youth will want to grow into rather than reject.
Thank you, Josipa. Avant de commencer et de poursuivre, tout d'abord, re-bienvenue à cette deuxième journée. J'aimerais aujourd'hui que nous parlions davantage de la relève dans le monde de la mobilité. Aujourd'hui, pensons à la marque que nous voulons laisser dans l'histoire du transport en commun. Les jeunes ont toujours été des acteurs de changement dans notre société, et en tant que jeune Canadienne, je peux certainement vous dire que ma génération veut voir plus de leadership de la part de nos gouvernements, de nos municipalités et des institutions envers un avenir vert, durable et prospère. Le développement économique et la protection de l'environnement peuvent se conjuguer ensemble. Beaucoup d'entre nous sommes déçus de la performance de nos pays en matière de protection du climat. Et bien que nous savons que la route sera longue et ardue, il est clair que les choses peuvent être faites autrement. Le Canada a toujours été vu comme un acteur exemplaire sur la scène internationale, mais dans cette lutte contre le changement climatique, notre pays présente un visage peu rassurant. Je crois que nous avons tout le talent et la volonté politique nécessaires pour paver la route de l'énergie renouvelable et d'une nouvelle forme de consommation énergétique. Je sais aujourd'hui, tout comme vous, que l'industrie du transport en commun aura un rôle monumental à jouer dans notre capacité à répondre à nos engagements climatiques. Nous faisons face à une crise environnementale sans précédent. Une crise qui nécessite que chacun d'entre nous change sa manière de consommer et de vivre. Vous comprendrez donc que cette conférence est également l'opportunité de discuter des outils que nous donnerons aux jeunes et à la société de demain pour réduire leurs émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Nous devons aussi faire de la mobilité durable un secteur plus attrayant pour les jeunes, en nous assurant de leur offrir des modes de transport verts, fiables et diversifiés. Pour y arriver, il faudra plus de jeunes aux tables de discussion. Employons de nouveaux visages, consultons-les, impliquons les jeunes dans la recherche et le développement de pistes de solutions concrètes. Le monde de la mobilité durable a besoin d'une relève.
Merci, Carla. With the impetus of a global world relying on us, and with the needs of our youth pressing upon us to succeed, I welcome you once again to the second day of CUTRIC's second annual Low Carbon Smart Mobility Technology Conference. Welcome and bienvenue.